Neil Diamond is more than just a legendary figure in pop rock. He is America's lifeblood, the spirit of a country that discovered its voice in his music. Sweet Caroline, a song he gave the world, is a timeless tune of joy and remembrance that reverberates through stadiums and transcends generations of love and sadness. However, that golden voice belies a guy who has weathered storms that few people could ever make it through. From an impoverished Brooklyn youngster, he overcame rejection and suffering to become one of the world's most adored singer-songwriters. 2 divorces, faraway kids, and a loneliness so deep that not even celebrity could ease. Each cut, each restless night, each tear. Millions of hearts were healed by his transformation into song. He didn't merely perform despite the pain in his own heart. On stage, he bled, transforming grief into something sacred, agony into art, and despair into devotion. However, fate dealt its last blow as the stage lights went out. Parkinson's disease has been cruel, making his last years tragic at the age of 84. Keep your eyes on him, because what he is going through right now might be the most agonizing and profound period of this legend's life. If his music has ever reached your heart, then take a moment, leave a like, as a quiet tribute to the man who gave everything to the world, and somehow still hasn't stopped giving. It's strange, almost cruel, how some lives begin with heartbreak long before the world even notices them. Some hearts come into this world already cracked, carrying wounds too deep for childhood to mend. And Neil Diamond was one of those souls. His story didn't begin with fame or fortune. It began with silence. The kind that hums through thin apartment walls in Brooklyn, where dreams are scarce and hope is stretched thin like bread on a table meant to feed too many. One day the world would call him a legend. But in the beginning, he was just a quiet boy trying to make sense of life between the echoes of war and the weight of his parents' unspoken fears. Neil Leslie Diamond was born on January 24, 1941, in Brooklyn, New York, while the world outside was tearing itself apart in the chaos of World War II. His parents, Akiba Kieve Diamond and Rose Diamond, were Jewish immigrants from Russia and Poland, 2 people who carried faith in their hearts and hunger in their hands. His father sold dry goods door to door, trudging through icy streets for a few coins, while his mother kept the home together with prayer, patience, and quiet strength. Winters were merciless. Wind slithered through cracked windows, heat faded too quickly, and the family moved from one tiny apartment to another, never staying long enough to grow roots. Neil learned early that nothing lasts forever, not warmth, not comfort, not even love's gentle promises. And when his father was drafted into the army, the fragile calm of their small world finally broke. Rose packed what little they owned and boarded a train to Cheyenne, Wyoming, a place so far, so wide it felt like another planet. There were no familiar voices there, only the sound of wind sweeping across open land and the heavy ache of missing home. At night, while his mother mended worn clothes beneath a flickering bulb, Neil would slip into the local cinema. He'd sit alone in the dark, watching singing cowboys on the screen, men whose voices were steady, whose hearts never seemed to break. Those melodies reached him in a way that words never could. In those songs, he found a kind of warmth that real life couldn't offer. Years later, he would reflect quietly. It wasn't an easy home, but it was filled with love and a lot of silence. I think music became the way I spoke to the world when words wouldn't come. When the war finally ended, the Diamonds returned to Brighton Beach, where the ocean smelled of salt and sweat, the scent of working families chasing fragile American dreams. The boy who once watched his father disappear into uniform now stood by the shore, watching the waves roll in and wondering if he'd ever find a place that truly felt like his own. He was shy, inward and observant, the kind of boy who spoke less, but saw everything. He was the kind of boy who felt everything too deeply. While other kids filled the Brooklyn streets with laughter and stickball games, Neil sat alone with a pencil and scraps of paper, trying to untangle the chaos inside his mind. Where others shouted, he wrote. Where others played, he dreamed. Those early poems weren't just words, and they were lifelines. His way of turning confusion into something he could understand, something that made sense in a world that rarely did. Then, when he turned 15, came a small miracle. one that would change everything. A $9 guitar, a gift from his parents who could hardly afford it. It was secondhand, chipped along the edges, and barely stayed in tune. But to Neil, it wasn't just wood and strings. It was salvation. He'd sit for hours in the glow of a single lamp, the room dim except for that fragile circle of light, teaching himself chords until his fingers bled, and his mother worried quietly from the next room. The guitar wasn't a toy. It was his escape, his diary, his confession. Each note became a heartbeat, raw, imperfect, but real. In those long, quiet nights, the shy boy from Brooklyn began to disappear. And in his place, a songwriter was being born. It became more than an instrument. It was a lifeline, a bridge between his silence and the world outside. Through that guitar, Neil found a way to translate ache into something the world could finally hear. That same year, he wrote his very first song, Hear Them Bells, for a girl at school. What began as a simple teenage crush soon became something sacred. His first realization that music could make him visible, even when no one was paying attention. In melodies, he found what words could never say, the feeling of being seen. By 16, his school grades had begun to slip, but his spirit had awakened. He was no longer just a boy from Brooklyn. He was a seeker. The son of a door-to-door salesman, born to immigrant parents who had survived war, hunger, and fear, Neil had already learned the hardest truth of all. The difference between hunger and desire. He wasn't starving for food, he was starving for meaning. And within that hunger lay the spark of destiny. Picture it. A boy too small for the guitar in his hands, his fingers trembling, his voice barely a whisper. And yet somehow it all fit, because sometimes the universe hands you something that feels too big for you, just to see if you'll grow into it. Every legend begins in a place no one notices, but few begin in hunger. For Neil Diamond, the road to music was never paved with applause or open doors. It began with silence, rejection, and the cold bite of loneliness, the kind that follows you home and sits with you in the dark. The same boy who once whispered songs into the walls of a Brooklyn apartment now faced the question every dreamer must one day answer. Do I keep singing, even if no one is listening? The question was simple, but it cut deep. Was the dream worth the loneliness? By 18, Neil had his answer. He packed a bag, left Brooklyn, and took his guitar to the city that never slept, Manhattan. The sidewalks were crowded, the air heavy with ambition, and every doorway seemed to echo with someone else's song. He played anywhere that would let him. Smoky bars, college cafeterias, even subway stations where his voice fought against the rumble of trains. He wasn't famous, not even close. But something in his voice made strangers stop for just a second longer than they meant to. He'd sing about heartbreak before he had truly known it. About loss before life had taken much from him. And still, the words felt true. That truth was his currency. Days turned into years. He worked at a publishing house writing songs for others. Songs that would become hits under someone else's name. He'd hand them over like pieces of his soul wrapped in envelopes for $25 a week. It paid the bills, but it starved his spirit. And then one night, after yet another rejection from a record label, Neil sat alone in his apartment. The walls felt smaller, the silence heavier. He looked at his guitar, the same chipped secondhand miracle, and whispered, "Maybe they're right. Maybe this dream isn't for me." But something inside him refused to die. That hunger, the one that had followed him since childhood, whispered back, "Then make them listen." The next morning, he wrote with fire. The words came like lightning, raw and untamed. "I'm a believer." It wasn't written for him, but it carried his heartbeat. When the Monkees recorded it, it exploded across the world. Millions sang the song, but few knew the name behind it. Neil Diamond was no longer invisible. He was the ghost in every melody, the unseen soul behind every chorus. And yet fame didn't come with light. It came with shadow. He had tasted success, but not as himself. He had given the world his voice, but not his face. That kind of hunger doesn't fade. It deepens. By his late 20s, Neil stood again at a crossroads. Would he keep writing for others, or finally sing his own truth? He chose truth, and that choice changed everything. When Neil finally chose to step out of the shadows, the world wasn't waiting with open arms. Record executives called him too serious, too poetic, too different. But Neil wasn't trying to fit in anymore. He had spent half his life chasing approval. Now, he was chasing truth. In a small recording studio with peeling paint and flickering lights, he pressed record. There was no producer breathing down his neck, no polished chorus. Just Neil, his voice trembling with something between pain and prayer. He sang, and no one heard it all, not even the chair. It was I Am, said. A song that didn't just speak, it confessed. It wasn't about fame or love or money. It was about belonging, and the lack of it. And in those words, millions of people suddenly saw their own reflection. The critics didn't understand it, but the world did. By the early 70s, Neil Diamond wasn't just another name on a record sleeve. He was a voice you felt. Every concert felt like a sermon. Every lyric like a secret you'd been waiting for someone to say out loud. When he sang Sweet Caroline, stadiums shook. But behind the spotlight, Neil remained that same boy from Brooklyn, still hungry, still searching. Fame gave him everything and took just as much. The crowds roared, but the nights were silent. The applause faded, and all that remained was the echo of his own thoughts. He had dreamed of being seen, but visibility came with a price: privacy, peace, and sometimes even purpose. By his 40s, the world called him a legend, but legends, he learned, are often built on broken hearts. His marriage fell apart, his voice began to wear thin, and the fire that once burned so bright started to flicker. He looked in the mirror and saw not the diamond the world admired, but the man beneath it, cracked by time and pressure. Still, he kept singing, because singing was never about being perfect, and it was about being honest. Then came the silence, a doctor's diagnosis. Parkinson's. The very hands that had written melodies for decades now trembled. The voice that had carried generations began to betray him. The news hit him like a storm. For the first time in his life, Neil Diamond couldn't sing without pain. The world moved on to younger voices, newer stars, but Neil had already written his eternity. He didn't chase stages anymore. He found peace in the small things, morning light through the curtains, the laughter of his grandchildren, the quiet hum of a city that once made him dream. And every now and then, when the tremor calmed, he'd still strum that old guitar, the chipped $9 one, the one that started it all, because that guitar was never just wood and strings. It was his lifeline, his proof that beauty can grow out of hunger, that pain can be translated into sound, and that the smallest voice can echo across decades if it's honest enough. In one of his final interviews, a reporter asked him, "If you could go back and tell your younger self one thing, what would it be?" Neil smiled softly. "I'd tell him, keep playing, even when no one's listening, because someday they will." That's the thing about Neil Diamond. He never sang to be famous, he sang to survive. And in doing so, he gave survival a soundtrack. Even now, when his voice shakes, when he forgets lyrics, when the lights dim, the audience still rises. Because they're not clapping for perfection, they're clapping for truth. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of all. Not the gold records, not the awards, not the fame, but the reminder that somewhere inside every broken person is a song waiting to be heard. So if you ever find yourself standing alone in a dark room, wondering if your voice matters, remember Neil Diamond. Remember the boy who turned hunger into harmony, who wrote through rejection, who kept believing even when no one else did. Because the world doesn't need another perfect singer. It needs another honest one. And maybe that's you. Fade out, soft piano plays I Am, I said. Camera pans over black and white photos. A boy with a chipped guitar. A man in sequins under blinding lights. An old artist smiling quietly in the corner of a stage. He was never just a singer. He was a mirror, and in every song we saw ourselves, raw, imperfect, and still worth listening to.